Because of time constraints, even though I asked for a few extra minutes, I modified the title to call the Diary and Correspondence of Yehuda Grinker, Self-Praise and Observations by an Israeli emissary in French Morocco, August 1954, February 1956. So indeed, this presentation is about Yehuda Grinker, an Israeli emissary dispatched to Morocco to organize Aliyah, immigration, to Israel, particularly from the rural southern Bilad, the countryside, mainly in the Atlas Mountains. Grinker represented the Tnuat HaMoshavim, the movement of cooperative farms, the one affiliated with Israel's dominant Mapai party, and the Jewish Agency's immigration department. His diary, called Aliyat Yehudei Atlas, the immigration of the Atlas Jewish communities, and testimonies containing letters of correspondence with the Jewish Agency and Tnuat HaMoshavim. They deal with the conditions of Moroccan Jewry at a critical juncture of the Moroccan nationalist movement's struggle for independence against French colonialism. In his writing, Grinker did not only concentrate on Jewish life or his zealous efforts in the search of Jewish farmers. During this transition period from colonial domination to Moroccan national independence, finally achieved in March 1956, the whole process of organizing immigration is laid out, as is Israel's policy regarding immigration selection processes known as selektia, based on medical and social criteria, which more often than not collided with the Israeli emissaries' determination to evacuate as many Jews as possible for one of the largest diasporas. In 1954, there were still about 250,000 Jews in Morocco, more than two-thirds of whom gradually opted for Aliyah. We begin in June 1954, when Shlomo Zalman Shragai, head of the Jewish Agency's immigration department in Jerusalem, visited Morocco and Tunisia. Though he thought that conditions for Tunisia and Tunisia's rural Jewish inhabitants were far worse than in Morocco due to the very intense struggle for nationhood against the French, the decision by the French Prime Minister at the time, Pierre Mendès France, who by the way was Jewish, at the end of the following month, July, to grant Tunisia political autonomy as a first crucial step toward full independence, spelled greater political security for Tunisian Jews. This left, given the fact that the struggle for national liberation in Algeria had not yet begun, this left Morocco as the most vulnerable spot in the anti-colonial struggle and the potential effects it could have on the Jews. Yet as late as early August 1954, no practical steps were implemented in Jerusalem to increase Aliyah, to include partial or full evacuation of the endangered Jewish villages as part of a possible rescue operation that was debated in May 1954. This despite the fact that in August 54, marking the first anniversary of Moroccan Sultan Mohammed ben Yusuf's exile by the French to Madagascar for his pro-nationalist inclinations, terrorism became widespread as he had become the symbol of the anti-colonial manifestations. Urban terrorist groups sprang in the major cities. Likewise, rural bands began fighting, aiming to pressure the French to bring back the Sultan. On August 3, 1954, in the town of Petit-Jean, 7 Jews were massacred. Until then, the Jews were not singled out, nor had there been any action of specifically anti-Jewish character nationwide. In August 54 and throughout 1955, however, the urban and rural fighters, though directing most of the ire against the French, did not spare the Jews. There were attacks and property damage during the summer of 1955 in Safi, Boujad, Ouazzane, Mazagan, Ruika, and Tiznit. In Safi and Mazagan, these attacks show signs of being deliberate and premeditated. Many Jews fled their rural communities in search to seek refuge in the urban area, until still unaffected by terrorism. On August 23, 1955, in Mazagan, located northwest of Casablanca, eight Jews were killed and 40 wounded. Dozens of shops and homes were burned to the ground. Enter Yehuda Grinker. The Jewish Agency and the Israeli government had now to confront the dual challenge of increasing Aliyah quotas from urban Morocco and adhering to an earlier decision to evacuate the various villages in the Atlas Mountains. As noted, to realize the latter decision, the Jewish Agency, in conjunction with Tnuat HaMoshavim, sent to the scene Yehuda Grinker to bolster the efforts of the Jewish Agency's Immigration Department offices in Morocco, known as Kadima, the Kadima operation. It was part and parcel of the policy of bringing to Israel, via France, immigrants and integrating them in rural and semi-rural moshavim and other settlements in northern and southern Israel for the pursuance of agricultural endeavors. But it was also meant to resettle immigrants in these areas' development towns. Grinker, a resident of the historic Jewish settlement of Nahalal, a moshav in northern Israel that falls under the jurisdiction of Jezreel Valley Regional Council, arrived in Morocco via France in the end of August 1954 at the height of the anti-French nationalist struggle. He visited 87 villages and towns in the Bilad, in the countryside, between September 1954 and January 1956, often traveling hundreds of kilometers to the Atlas Mountains, accompanied by a guard and a driver. Soon he was also joined by members of the social selection criteria team. Once arriving at the foot of the mountains, he would reach the Jews in the villages and small towns riding on mules, quite a challenge for a man in his mid-50s. Whether in integrated village neighborhoods where Berber Muslims and Jews lived together, or in the village's mellahs, the Jewish quarters, the residential quarters, Grinker organized the immigration of 13,553 persons, consisting of 2,941 families, a remarkable achievement. Yet not all villages were evacuated to the fullest, and there were dozens of Atlas towns and villages still out of reach. As part of Kadima's personnel, he would determine which individuals or families were suitable for either regular absorption into Israeli development towns or for agricultural life in the rural moshavim, based on social criteria: number of able-bodied breadwinners aged 18 to 45, number of family dependents, physical handicaps, or if, for instance, a widow had children over 18 who could help support her in Israel. Those disqualified were transferred from the endangered villages and towns to the urban centers to be cared for by the American Jewish Joint Distribution Committee, AJDC. Each breadwinner could be accompanied by 6 additional family members. If there was only one breadwinner per family, with over 6 dependents, then 2 or 3 young children could be separated from their parents temporarily and be integrated into the youth Aliyah organization known as Aliyat HaNoar, which functioned in Morocco as well. For those who passed the selection criteria, there awaited another selection hurdle: the medical examination. The Kadima operational headquarters in Casablanca would arrange for the transport of the villagers to the medical examination centers managed by local physicians, mainly European residents recruited by Kadima. A most inconvenient process for the candidates, considered that they had to travel as many as 200 kilometers in each direction. Unlike the major urban centers, many small Atlas communities had neither physicians at hand nor X-ray equipment. The candidates' health records were then sent to Casablanca, where an Israeli physician working under the aegis of Kadima, representing Israel's Ministry of Health, made the final decision which families were eligible health-wise for Aliyah. Those who passed the social and medical selection were placed at the Kadima transit camp on the Mazagan Road between Casablanca and Mazagan, after which time they would travel to the Jewish Agency's travel camp in Marseille and subsequently by ships to Israel. If in Israel there was no room to absorb the immigrants immediately, Kadima would either delay their departure from Marseille to the port of Haifa, or it had to adhere to the stringent monthly quotas in Morocco itself, another type of delay. Grinker met the Jewish villagers and small town folk to inform them about life in Israel. He claims to have refrained from making false promises and told them about the hardships that the Jewish state had confronted since its inception. He admitted that the final decision of Aliyah was not his alone and had been largely confined to the Israeli physician. On many occasions, it seems, Eliezer Matan, the Israeli physician, was persuaded by Grinker to soften stringent medical selection for villagers, even waive them for those villagers dwelling in remote areas where Jews could not reach the medical examination centers, or they confronted physical danger. In 1954-55, Grinker found that in certain Atlas villages, albeit certainly not in all of them, and especially in the High Atlas, Jews did engage in agricultural pursuits. The Muslim Berbers owned much of the land, while the Jews employed by them enjoyed the usufruct of the land, produce, and they included sharecroppers. Given the Jews' potential service for Jewish nation building, Grinker believed, and I emphasize believed, they constituted the best element in Moroccan Jewish society for Aliyah absorption. And I quote him, "The more I visited these Berber villages and became acquainted with their inhabitants, the more I was convinced that these Jews constituted the best and most suitable elements for settlement in Israel's absorption centers. There were many positive aspects I found among them. First and foremost, they all know their agricultural task, and their transfer to agricultural work in Israel will not involve physical and mental hardships. They are satisfied with few material needs, which will enable them to confront their early economic problems. It is possible to settle them in mountainous regions, in the Negev, and elsewhere. There will be one other problem, however, how to train them to utilize various modern tools which are so vital nowadays." End quote. Grinker discovered that educational institutions were badly lacking in numerous Atlas communities, in contrast to the urban counterparts, and this was true. Whereas the educational network of the Alliance Israélite Universelle and the religious school network of the Lubavitch movement and the Sephardi American network of Otzar Torah established schools in both Moroccan urban and rural regions, their penetration into the Atlas occurred at a slower pace. When the colonial era drew to a close in 1956, numerous Atlas communities were still unaffected by their educational networks. Grinker's observations exposed data on the Jews that was virtually unknown in Israel at the time. Simultaneously, it is replete by a melange of stereotypical and romanticized portrayal of Atlas Jewry, but equally of urban Jews, whom he also registered for immigration on Kadima's behalf when not traveling to the rural milieu. He reports that men wore long black woolen gowns, jalabiyas, worn in both summer and winter. They covered their heads with a black kippah, whereas the Muslims wore a white kippah. And I quote, "When I asked why Jews dress in black," Grinker recalls, "I was told that many years ago, one of the Moroccan sultans ordered them to wear black because even the demons loved this color." End quote. Women too wore jalabiyah that was gentler than the men's and also, as Grinker observed, rather feminine. They covered their heads with a black scarf. Children also wore jalabiyas, and Grinker reported that in many villages the children roamed the narrow passages of the mellachs of the Jewish neighborhoods, received meager or no education whatsoever. In most villages, the Jews could neither read nor write, with the sole exception of the local community rabbi and the lay leader. I quote, "I was surprised by their facial appearance and physique. They look like biblical figures. Tall, bearded men, their facial expression being one of grace and ancient splendor. Yet when I spoke to them, I soon realized how ignorant and shallow they are. Despite their ignorance, I found it fascinating to learn how they remember by heart the ritual prayers. The head of the household is the unchallenged master. He makes all the decisions, and members of his family follow his commands. Bigamy is a rarity among Atlas Jewry, as is also true for the rest of Moroccan Jewry." End quote. As for the Jewish women and their agricultural role, Grinker conveyed that, and I quote, "They are hardly idle in contrast to their urban counterparts. They work the fields with their husbands, particularly during the harvesting season. When I saw the women gathering the crops, I could compare them to Ruth the Moabite, Ruth HaMoaviyah, and their husbands to Boaz, the biblical figure in the book of Ruth. In the winter, the women take care of between 10 to 20 chickens at their home, a goat, a sheep, and most often a cow. This is how the families gain access to eggs, milk, and cheese." End quote. Nevertheless, the Jews resorted to the most primitive farming methods. And again, I quote him, "When I compare their methods to those of our Arab neighbors in Israel, such as the use of agricultural equipment, crop rotation, and the like, it appears that the agricultural laborers in Morocco lag behind by no less than 100 years. It is enough to go out to the field in the winter and witness how the laborers or farmers rely on a bull, a donkey, or a camel. Anyone who has some sense about farming would realize immediately, and he was a farmer, realize immediately that these rural workers belong to the past, to prehistoric times. Their work in the field begins with the first rain cycle. For prior to that, their primitive plow used in Morocco cannot penetrate the soil. In the winter, they sow the winter crops, and by the end of spring, they sow the crops for the summer. In the summer, they engage in harvesting using a sickle. This is accomplished by the end of August. September, October, and part of November are a time of rest." End quote. Grinker's eyewitness accounts are rather insightful about the political situation. He paints a fairly reliable picture of Jewish vulnerabilities and the growing turbulence in Morocco during the struggle for independence. In other words, his diary and correspondence shed significant light on the political and social situation in Morocco as a whole. In his assessment, the role of Morocco became increasingly uncertain, and the Jews faced difficult dilemmas. Should they continue to live in their country of origin for the time being, or should they leave immediately? What future would they have in Morocco once the French are gone? It reminded him of the 1948 Israeli War of Independence, of which he was also an eyewitness, and the panic it stirred among the Arabs of Palestine. Just as Grinker understood the fears and uncertainties of the Palestine Arabs in 48, once the British mandate ended and the fighting erupted, he understood equally the hesitations and anxieties prevalent among Moroccan Jewry in the mid-1950s on the brink of national independence. Grinker remarked that, and I quote, "A day does not go by without bombs being exploded in one building or another, without urban commercial houses owned by European settlers or Jews being set on fire, not to mention widespread casualties on all sides. There is also the rich Oriental imagination that fuels panic over unconfirmed rumors." End quote. From his account, it is clear that Grinker thought the position of the rural villages and small towns of the Atlas could become far more precarious than in the large urban agglomerations. True, most of the murder victims and those who sustained property damage, whether Muslims, European settlers, or Jews, were urbanites. But Grinker believed that soon the real tragedies would befall on the rural Jews. He cites examples whereby the latter approached him to be rescued immediately. For instance, quote, Jews from the villages in the region of Eit Buli and Tel Wad arrived in Casablanca to see me in order to expedite their Aliyah. They stressed that they could no longer live among the Muslim neighbors who are harassing them on a daily basis and demanding of them to evacuate the villages, saying, these houses are not your houses, and the land is not your land. Get out! Exclamation mark, end quote. The same mode of panic and anxiety were naturally felt in the urban areas, where both urbanites and villagers from the Atlas reached the Kadima immigration centers. According to Grinker, from my first visit to Marrakesh and on to the present time, piles upon piles of written requests for Aliyah had accumulated. People were invited to register. A long line was formed at the Kadima office. In order to prevent disorder, numbers were issued to all those waiting in line. The pressure was overwhelming, and the registration lasted for many long hours. Due to the overcrowding, people lost their patience, having feared that their turn would not come. It caused a commotion, which could not be controlled, and consequently, the registration process was temporarily halted. He then refers to the city of Mazagan. I found here in the YMCA Center refugees from the anti-colonial riots that affected local Jews in August 1955. Out of 240 families present, 75 were approved for Aliyah, consisting of 609 persons, with the rest, to my chagrin, having been disqualified by the social selection team due to the policy dictated by the Jewish Agency in Israel, and which I was unable to challenge. I must admit that even for the 75 families, we exercised great flexibility to have them approved. Grinker describes a city in ruin when he talks about ruins, when he talks about Casablanca, burned homes, businesses plundered, widespread destruction in the Jewish community, and refugees with only the shirts on their backs who were totally impoverished. He says, in my mind, he remarked, in my mind, this scene is reminiscent of the pogroms in the Ukraine and in the Eastern European countries. 3 days before the Mazagan riots, on August 20, 1955, Grinker cabled to Yehuda Brzezinski, the head of the Jewish Agency's absorption department in Israel, ringing the bells of alarm. And this is related to what Chaim talked about, that sometimes in a letter you try to convey a message either to a person you know or you don't know, but you want to make a very blunt point. He writes to him, I beg of you to transmit to the members of the General Executive Council of the World Zionist Organization, which is scheduled to be held in Jerusalem, my plea. Rescue the Jewish villagers who are scattered throughout Morocco! Exclamation mark. Much has been said before about the good quality of this human element for Israel. It is true that if the French lose control of the situation, then the Jews of Casablanca and of other cities may become the earliest victims. Yet God forbid if the violence will spread to the Jewish villagers. The latter will most certainly be annihilated. No one would really care about their faith, whereas in the cities, the authorities, the police, and the army will intervene. End of quote. Conclusions. After Grinker's departure in February 1956, 1 month before Moroccan national independence, Kadima's social criteria team, together with Grinker's brother Yitzhak, were charged with the evacuation of part of or all of the physically endangered and remote communities. As a result of Yehuda Grinker's efforts and his successors, 40% of the immigrant families were absorbed in rural settlements and 60% were directed to development towns. There weren't that many farmers there after all. They were mostly peddlers, small merchants, and not real farmers, perhaps agricultural workers. The agricultural settlers were sent to 3 districts: Ta'anach in the north, Bet Jubrin in the northeastern Negev, and Fallujah in the north-central Negev. The non-agricultural settlers were settled in towns in the Galilee, such as Tzfat, Chatzor, and Tarshiha. In Bet She'an, and in the Jerusalem corridor, meaning heart of Colonia and Castel. In the areas between Be'er-Tuvia and Majdal, which is Ashkelon as well. In Beersheba, Eilat, Dimona, Acre, right here, and Tiberias. Though Grinker often highlighted his efforts and achievements, and he did that with great talent and with great zeal, none of his efforts would have come to fruition had the French authorities failed to cooperate with the Jewish agency. Though occasionally the French sought to curb Aliyah, especially from urban centers, their policy vis-à-vis Aliyah was generally positive, in line with the amicable Franco-Israeli relations nurtured since the early 1950s. They realized, the French, that Aliyah could not be stifled, but opposed any mode of departure which might shake the local balance of forces, provoking Moroccan authorities and the nationalists. Kadima's operation came to a grinding halt following Moroccan independence. The Aliyah process tolerated by the French now became illegal. It was replaced by an underground railway, guided by Israel's Mossad. It was replaced during Kadima's 7 years of activity. However, 90,000 Jews reached Israel. In the underground period of 1956-1961, another 18,000 Jews were smuggled out of the country. Then, during Operation Yachin, which had the discreet blessing of the new king, Hassan II, no longer Sultan, now it's king in independent Morocco, another 114,000 Jews immigrated to Israel in the decade of 1961-1971. It included most, if not all, of what had remained of Atlas Jewry. Thank you.